Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah, excited to be here.
Today we're going back in time a little bit to the space race, but not for the reasons you might expect.
Definitely not your typical space stuff today.
We're going to be looking at the space race through the lens of art, specifically through the lens of retrofuturism.
It's going to be a really fascinating deep dive.
Now, you listening at home, you let us know you're also interested in holograph printing. So as we're going through all this, we'll be pulling in some tips from that art guide that you sent us.
Yeah, I love that art guide. So many great ideas in there.
But first, can you even imagine a time when everyone on Earth was glued to their TVs and radios watching these two superpowers?
The US and the Soviet Union.
Right, battling it out to see who could get to space first.
Talk about a global obsession, right? Everyone wanted to see who would win the space race.
It must have been unbelievable. It was the 50s and 60s.
The Cold War, so much tension, but everyone was looking up.
Totally. Satellites going up, animals in orbit, and then eventually humans on the moon.
It's hard to capture the feeling now, but it felt like anything was possible back then.
Which brings us to retrofuturism. I'm so curious to hear more about this. How would you define this for anyone listening who's not familiar with the term?
So retrofuturism is this really cool art movement that popped up during the 50s and 60s.
Right in the heart of the space race.
Exactly. And the artists were trying to imagine what the future would look like, what life would be like.
Based on all the excitement surrounding space travel.
Absolutely. But what's so interesting is that their vision of the future is, well, pretty different from how things actually turned out.
Like flying cars. I'm guessing we're not all zipping around in those just yet, huh?
Not quite, though you've got to admit the self-driving car thing is getting pretty close.
That's true.
Yeah.
But beyond the cars, what else did this future look like to these artists?
Oh man, you name it. Rocket-powered everything. Personal spacecraft, like you could just hop in and zoom off to the moon. Huge domed cities, underwater cities, robots doing all our chores. It was this really optimistic, almost utopian view of how technology could shape our lives.
It's like they took the excitement of the space race and channeled it into imagining solutions for all sorts of problems. Did they think technology could solve everything?
There's definitely a sense of optimism there, but if you look closer, there's also some anxiety woven in.
Oh, interesting. Like, what kind of anxiety?
Well, remember, this was the post-World War II era. People were grappling with things like population growth, pollution, the threat of nuclear war, and I think some of that fear is reflected in the art, even with all the shiny tech and futuristic gadgets.
It's like they're exploring both the promises and the potential pitfalls of technology all through this very stylized lens.
Exactly, and visually, it's so striking.
Those illustrations, with the bold lines and really interesting textures.
Right, it's very graphic.
It makes me think of holograph printing. Have you ever worked with that?
I have. It's such a cool technique.
Yeah, for our listener out there who's also interested in holograph, can you get a little bit of a breakdown of what it is and how it works?
Yeah, so basically, with holograph, you're building up a textured surface on your printing plate. It's kind of like making a collage, but instead of putting it on a canvas, you're putting it on a plate that you'll use to make prints.
So it's like a 3D collage almost.
Yeah, you can use all sorts of materials. Fabric, string, sandpaper, cardboard, you name it.
The possibilities are endless. Now, the art guide that you sent us, it recommends starting with like a really sturdy cardboard, right, as your base.
Yeah, a good solid foundation is key. Then you just start layering. You can cut shapes out of cardboard, use textured fabrics, even things like leaves or bark.
Sounds so tactile and experimental. Okay, so you've built up this amazing textured plate. Then what? How do you actually create the print?
Okay, so the next step is inking up your plate, and the guide really stresses this, making sure you get ink down into all the little nooks and crannies of your texture.
Makes sense. You want all those details to show up.
Totally. A brayer is the best tool for this, a kind of roller that spreads the ink evenly.
All right, inked plate, what's next?
Now you carefully lay a sheet of paper over the inked plate, and then you press it down firmly using a printing press, or even just a baren or a spoon.
Really? Anything that can apply even pressure?
Yep. The pressure is what transfers the ink from the plate to the paper. And then the big reveal, you peel back the paper.
And there's your print.
Exactly.
Oh.
Each print is unique because of the way the ink interacts with the textures.
It's a really cool process. And I was looking through the art guide, and there was a whole section on some of the challenges people run into with holograph printing. Like the guide talks about getting the right ink consistency. What are some other things that people should watch out for?
Inconsistency is huge.
Right.
Too thick and you lose all that beautiful detail.
Right. It would just be a big blob.
And too thin and you get a really weak print. But even pressure is important too, like I was saying earlier. You want to make sure you're pressing down evenly across the whole plate so you don't end up with any blurry sections.
I can imagine that's tricky.
And you know what else the guide mentions? The type of paper you use can make a big difference, too.
Oh, how so?
A smooth paper is going to give you a very different look compared to a textured paper. So it's all about experimenting and seeing what effects you like.
Now tie all this back to retrofuturism for us. How could someone use Colograph to create their own retro-inspired artwork?
Oh, that's a great question. Think about those iconic elements of retrofuturism, like the shiny fins on a rocket ship. You could use foil or metallic paper to create that smooth, reflective surface in your colograph.
Cool.
Or you could create textures that represent the grids and patterns you often see in those domed cities.
It's like you're taking those futuristic designs and translating them into these tactile textured prints.
And what I love is how these seemingly separate topics, the space race, retrofuturism, and colograph printing, they all come together through this shared sense of wonder about the future and how we can express that wonder through art.
Right. And for our listener who's been with us on this deep dive, I want you to think about what your own personal version of a retro future would look like. What amazing inventions would you come up with?
Let your imagination run wild.
What would those textures feel like? Maybe give Colograph a try and bring your own retro future to life.
I can't wait to see what you create.
As always, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
See you next time.
See ya.